So for this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about role exit and emotion work as examples of role making. Role exit is a concept that builds on the work of a woman named Helen Rose Ebaugh. A little bit of her biography: she was a nun at one point, and she left the sisterhood. She went on to become a sociologist and wrote about the process of disentangling herself from the previous role that she occupied as a nun, and moving into a life after that, in which a lot of her identity was directly impacted by the fact that people who knew her and interacted with her knew her from her time before, and so it was very hard sometimes for them to see her as anything other than a nun, which was what she had been for them, in terms of identity for quite a long time. So she writes extensively about this process of exiting from one role and transitioning into a new one, in a book called Becoming an X, and she explores the contextual factors as well as some of the internal dynamics that shape what this process looks like, and it sort of interestingly sort of underscores the value, I think, of Cooley's perspective, that the way that other people see us, or at least the way we imagine that other people see us, is profoundly influential on how we see ourselves. So role exit is for her a process of disentanglement from a role that was central to one's self-identity, so that you can establish a new role and a new identity. And that process involves managing relationships that were formed in the previous role, and the identity and the looking glass self that was a reflection of those previous relationships, even as you sort of transition into this new one. And she says this process is really complicated by something called role residual, or kind of which calls a hangover identity, which is the continued identification that we maintain with a prior role, such that we're experiencing certain aspects of it even after we've left it. So some of these identities become central not just to how other people see us, but also how we see ourselves. Because again, as Cooley points out in his notion of a looking glass self, how others see us is really, really influential in how we see ourselves. So, a married couple forms friendships and social relations as a married couple with people in their community, parents and their kids at schools, people on the local neighborhood association, whatever it happens to be. The couple gets a divorce. It's very, very hard for the people who became friends of those two individuals as a couple to see those people as anything other than a couple. And as a result of that, people who are no longer in this couple who is no longer a couple, and may even be in new relationships with new people, still have to manage what information they share, what sorts of things they say, and how they say it about their previous partners or the relationship that existed prior to that, which is always going to create a little bit of an impingement on both the possible kinds of interactions that can unfold, but also the way in which the people who are in these situations, again, are kind of seeing themselves. Now, this is a little bit different than emotion work. Emotion work is also a kind of role-making activity that requires us to do some improvisation. I hope anyway, that it's obvious the way that would be required of a person engaging in a process of role exit. But in emotion work, what we're looking at are kind of emotional displays as self-presentation. And this is a really interesting kind of phenomenon, because for a lot of people, emotion is just this kind of involuntary reaction to a set of experiences or circumstances, right? A physiological response that our body has to certain experiential encounters, and the way that those resonate with, internal understandings and previous experiences, and the weight and gravity of certain social relationships, right? All of that stuff kind of comes into play. So Arlie Hochschild, who is the sociologist who's written extensively about emotion work, got into this topic and started exploring this field while she was sort of studying gender inequality, right? So gender inequality is probably the thing that Arlie Hochschild is most famous for. She wrote a book called The Second Shift, in which she talked about the way in which the entry of women into the formal labor force, right, working outside the home, which occurred especially for the white middle class, it occurred extensively in the 70s, the 80s. A lot of women began to move into professional careers outside the home as they gained educational experience and credentials, as they had fewer children because of increased reproductive control over their bodies, a shift in the culture that sort of downplayed the importance of stay-at-home moms and sort of celebrated, at least, even if it doesn't sort of align with what actually happened, celebrating a kind of co-parenting between, say, for example, a mother and a father. So she's really interested in what happens here. And what happens here, of course, is that women go out and they work, and then they come home, and they also still do almost all of the domestic work that they used to do when they were primarily stay-at-home moms, right? So it is as if they are working a second shift, which is where that term comes from. So that's Arlie Hochschild. And again, the stuff on second shift doesn't really have anything to do with role making, but I just wanted to give you a sense of sort of how she kind of came into this particular way of looking at role making, because women, it turns out, women do in the course of their occupations do a lot of emotion work. So she studied women in the workforce. She began to look at the way in which women are expected, more so than men, women are expected to present a certain sort of emotional state as an expectation of the jobs they offer, right? Women working in the service economy, for example, food service, hospitality, retail, things like that, they're expected to sort of be happy and convey not just a kind of expertise in terms of the work, but also an emotional state that is kind of attached to it. So you can think of flight attendants as being kind of a nice, maybe very common example of what that would look like. So she started theorizing a lot about what she calls emotion work, which is a process of evoking or suppressing or otherwise managing our feelings, which again seems kind of strange because most people think that feelings are just feelings, right? They're not subject to rules. They're not subject to manipulation. But her point is that emotion work is conducted. We do very much manage our emotions, or at least the displays of our emotions. And we do so according to a set of socially established feeling rules. The feeling rules are a set of understandings, basically. One set of understandings are built around what kinds of emotions are appropriate or acceptable or desirable in a given situation. The second set of understandings revolve around who's entitled to feel and express those emotions. The third set of understandings kind of organize or coalesce around what forms of expression or display are permissible. A really sort of pat example would be, at a funeral, right? A man who has died and leaves behind a wife and maybe a couple of kids, but also leaves behind a girlfriend or a mistress. Presumably both of those people, because they had an emotional relationship with this deceased person, are now emotionally sort of distraught. I think most people would agree that it would be highly inappropriate for the mistress or the girlfriend to show more overt sorrow and a greater sort of exaggerated display of loss than the widow. Regardless of whether the widow is feeling it more or the girlfriend is feeling it more, right? We would all sort of, I think, agree that it's really gauche. It's really inappropriate that this other person seems to be more bereft, seems to be more upset at this than the person's actual spouse. So that would be, one of those examples. So again, we do this emotion work according to these socially prescribed set of rules. And there are lots of different ways we acquire the rules, right? Normal patterns of socialization, media, experience in the social world, right? So we pick these things up, and when we express some degree of uncertainty or confusion, there are often agents of socialization, other people in society around us who will step in and kind of help us see and conform our behavior to those boundaries and to those expectations. So out of this sort of set of theorizing and studying that she does, she comes to the conclusion that there are kind of two kinds of acting. There is what she calls surface acting, and there is what she calls deep acting. Now, surface acting is where we try to sort of act the part. In other words, we put on an emotional display that we understand to be expected of us in this situation, even if that doesn't match our underlying mood, right? So, you're at again, funerals are really nice examples of this, right? You're at a funeral, you don't feel particularly sorry that this person is dead, not because you're heartless, but because maybe you weren't close, or maybe they lived a full and rich life and you know that they were in pain right toward the end. But even though you might feel relief that they've finally passed, or indifference to their passing, if you're at this funeral, you should probably put on a somber face. You should probably at least appear to be somewhat sad at the departure of this person, right? That's the expectation, and so you sort of compose your facial expressions, your body language, your posture, your tone of voice, the things you say, all of that self-presentation stuff is built around creating the impression that you are feeling some degree of sorrow. So you can see the way in which this can really nicely align with a sort of dramaturgical analysis or a Goffmanian analysis of these kinds of things as behavior, as self-presentation. Deep acting is a little bit different. Deep acting is when we try to actually suppress or feel actual emotions. So we might be very, very sorry, but it would be inappropriate for whatever reason for us to express that sorrow, so we mask it. Or we don't feel sorry, but it would be inappropriate for us to not feel sorrow, so we try to evoke it. In other words, the deep acting is an effort to sort of feel what it is we're supposed to be feeling, even if it isn't for the reason that we feel it. So a good example of this, when my grandfather passed away on my father's side. He was a very nice guy. I liked him a lot. We, as kids, he was a really, really fun grandfather to be around. He played. He was sort of very active. We all liked him, but we lived, 900 miles away. We didn't interact with him all that often as we were growing up. And so when he passed away, I might have been just about to start high school. Or very, very tail end of my my time in junior high school. And I remember my parents brought me into my bedroom and they told me that my grandfather had died. I wasn't really sad. Again, not because I didn't like the person, but just because, he was already kind of somebody I didn't really see all that often. I didn't have a strong, regular, recurring emotional relationship. But I knew, even at that age, I sort of knew that I was supposed to be sad. And so in an effort to try to do that, I imagined what I would feel like if my father died. Because here was my father telling me that his father had died. So I tried to sort of put myself in that place. And that made me sad, right? So I was able to be sad sort of for my father, not for his loss, but because I could, on some sort of empathetic level, imagine what he must be going through. So you know, it's a thing that we learn to do, right? We're sort of suppressing emotions that we feel but that are inappropriate, or trying to evoke emotions that we don't feel but we understand to be appropriate. That would be an example of deep acting, and that is a different kind of emotion work than surface acting, but sometimes that's the way you get there, right? So again, the point here is that all of these actions sort of require us to be attuned to the other people in the interaction around us, the broad social expectations that people have of us in these moments, and how to sort of craft role performances that create those impressions. And again, it's an example of a role making instead of role taking, because of that improvisational nature, because of the way in which we can get there through many different strategies. The important thing is that our role performance be one that is mapped onto and appropriate for the social expectations that are ahead of us in that moment. Role embracement and role embracement and role distance are two other kinds of I don't know if I would put these squarely in the field of emotion work, but I think they're very closely related. These are concepts that come out of the work of Irving Goffman, and they are definitely role-making activities. I don't know exactly how I would sort of categorize them, so I'm just kind of lumping them in here with emotion work. But role embracement is when we identify really strongly with a role and we allow it to shape how we think and feel and interact with others. Role distance is when we perform our role in a detached or insincere way, such that other people notice that we're being detached or insincere, which signals to them that we're not really connected to or not really kind of invested in that role. So this is stuff that's come up in work that I've done with homeless individuals, for example. So one of the things that happens for homeless people, there's a very interesting moment, and it happens after a person loses their home. So the night that a person loses their home, very few people will immediately say, I'm homeless, right? Because homeless is a kind of identity, at least in American culture, and I think in other cultures as well. It's a social identity, it's a personal identity. It's not something that it's not an immediate identity that comes along with a state of being, even if it's technically true that you are homeless. It isn't necessarily the case that you're going to see yourself that way, at least not right away. So what typically happens is the first night that a person is out on the street, they see this as a temporary problem. This is something that they're going to fix. They just have to get through the night, and then tomorrow they'll sort this all out. And then they call friends, and they might stay on a couch for some period of time or crash in a spare bedroom or something like that. So there's a period of adjustment. So sometime between the first night that you find yourself in a situation where you've lost your housing, and some point in the future, and it varies for each individual, and it varies according to a variety of other criteria. But at some point, the person stops thinking about themselves as a person who's experiencing a temporary loss of housing, and they start to think of themselves as a homeless person, right? You can imagine that, right? As time goes by, it becomes less and less and less a problem that you're going to fix tomorrow, and more an identity that you have to manage. Especially because as people around you increasingly see you as homeless, that's going to reinforce that identity. Again, note the notion of a looking glass self is incredibly relevant here. So what some people will do at the very beginning of their trajectory, as they move into acquiring a homeless identity, they will do the things that are associated with homelessness, but they will be very, very clear, both in terms of how they do it and even sometimes how they talk about what they're doing, to signal that they're not like these other people. And at some point, of course, that goes away, and the role becomes one that you embrace. Because if your social relations are increasingly going to be with other people who are on the street, it isn't really a good long-term strategy to spend a lot of time sort of pretending like you want nothing to do with these kinds of people. There's a really nice moment with one of the homeless people that I interviewed in London, who initially sort of saw himself in this situation where he was sort of just in a transitional phase. He was going to figure this out. He was going to get into housing. He was going to get back on his feet. And as time went on and on, it became less likely that he was going to be able to do that. And at one point, he's living in a hostel, which is, temporary housing for people who don't have, apartments or homes or things like that. So he's living in a hostel with a lot of other homeless people. And his father comes to visit him, and his father is like, "What are you doing here with these people?" And he's like, "Dad, I'm one of these people." And it was at that moment he sort of realizes that this is his identity, right? He goes from a situation in which his actions and behaviors are sort of purposed with creating some distance between him as a person who is homeless and a homeless person, versus a person, at the end of the trajectory, he has embraced the identity. He's in that group, and it's really kind of not possible for him anymore, and probably not advantageous for him anymore to pretend otherwise. So that you can think of the transition from one identity to a new identity. And I wonder, as I say this out loud, I wonder how much of this is kind of something that can map onto Ebaw's work, right? It's funny how teaching sort of prods you to think about things that you might not have thought about when you were sort of designing the lecture or designing the course. But I think that you can think of this as a kind of transition, becoming an ex-housed person and transitioning to a new role as a homeless person. And part of how that process is marked is by the distancing activities and narratives that we provide at the beginning, and the embracement that comes as we kind of fully are immersed in this new identity. So there's one more set of things that I want to talk about that are role-making activities, but I think this is quite a lot for one, so I'll cut it off here and pick it up next time with managing stigma and openings for interactions, and until then, I'll say have a good one.